Tonight's conversation is not just about Texas. It's not just about congressional maps, and it's certainly not just about one investigation. What unfolded in this discussion reveals something much larger, a struggle over control, legitimacy, and the future structure of American political power. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas and serving on both the House Judiciary and Oversight Committees, stepped into a debate that is rapidly becoming one of the defining political flashpoints of the coming election cycle: redistricting. At first glance, redrawing congressional lines may sound procedural, even boring. But in reality, it is one of the most consequential tools in American politics, because whoever draws the maps can influence who wins the seats, and whoever wins the seats controls the House. And whoever controls the House holds enormous constitutional authority, including certifying presidential elections. Crockett's argument begins with a warning. This is not merely a Texas issue. It is, in her framing, a national structural issue. She emphasizes that control of the House determines who oversees election certification, committee investigations, impeachment proceedings, and legislative priorities. When district lines are redrawn in a way that systematically advantages one party, she argues, it doesn't just shape midterm outcomes, it reshapes institutional power. She points to North Carolina as an example of how judicial control can influence political representation. After Republicans gained control of the state Supreme Court, congressional maps were redrawn. The result shifted the delegation from an evenly divided 7-7 split to a 10-4 Republican majority. That shift occurred despite statewide elections reflecting near 50-50 political division. To Crockett, that discrepancy illustrates what she sees as structural imbalance. When representation diverges sharply from voter distribution, she argues it raises fairness concerns. Critics, of course, counter that both parties have historically engaged in redistricting strategies when given control. Gerrymandering is not new. It is a tool used by whichever side holds power in state legislatures. But what makes this moment different, according to Crockett, is the broader national climate: heightened distrust, institutional tension, and deep polarization. Her comments connect redistricting to a larger conversation about democratic safeguards. She references the Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which effectively removed the federal preclearance requirement under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Prior to that ruling, certain states with documented histories of discriminatory voting practices were required to obtain federal approval before implementing changes to voting laws or district boundaries. After Shelby, that requirement disappeared. Crockett argues that this created an environment where states like Texas gained significantly more latitude in redrawing maps. She notes that recent population growth in Texas was driven largely by communities of color, yet newly added congressional seats did not reflect proportional demographic representation. In her view, that outcome suggests intentional dilution of minority voting strength. Supporters interpret her stance as a defense of representational equity. Opponents frame it as partisan disagreement over competitive advantage. But regardless of perspective, the stakes are high. The House majority is often decided by a handful of seats. Then the conversation pivots to another politically explosive issue: Jeffrey Epstein. The Epstein case continues to carry symbolic weight across the political spectrum. It intersects with public distrust of elites, institutional transparency, and accountability. During the interview, Crockett emphasizes that Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee want testimony from administration officials regarding the handling of Epstein-related materials. Her focus turns specifically toward questions of transparency and process. If files exist, why have they not been fully released? If they do not exist, why were prior statements suggesting otherwise made? What criteria determine what becomes public? These questions reflect a broader tension: public confidence in the Department of Justice. Crockett expands her concerns beyond Epstein. She questions personnel decisions within the DOJ and raises the possibility of retaliatory firings. While not alleging specific illegality in the interview, she signals skepticism about internal governance and independence. Institutional trust has become a central theme in American politics. When voters believe agencies operate impartially, Confidence remains stable. When suspicion grows, regardless of which party is in power, polarization intensifies. The interview then shifts toward a more personal dimension. President Trump's remarks about Crockett and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. In a public statement, Trump suggested both should take IQ tests, describing them as low IQ. Such language reflects the combative rhetorical style that has defined much of the modern political era. Crockett responds firmly but strategically. Rather than escalating personal insults, she reframes the issue as a distraction from economic concerns. She references inflation, employment data, and healthcare policy. Her message is clear. While Americans face financial pressure, leadership attention should be directed toward policy outcomes rather than personality clashes. At the same time, she defends her qualifications and education, pushing back against what she characterizes as a broader narrative directed toward women of color in politics. She emphasizes earned credentials and rejects the framing implied in the insult. This exchange highlights an ongoing dynamic in contemporary politics, the blending of policy debate with personal rhetoric. In an era of viral clips and social media amplification, sharp language often dominates headlines more than legislative details. Yet beneath the surface-level controversy lies a structural through-line tying the entire interview together. Power consolidation versus institutional balance. Redistricting affects representation. Representation affects House control. House control influences investigative authority. Investigative authority shapes public transparency narratives. Public narratives affect electoral outcomes. And electoral outcomes determine future redistricting cycles. It is a feedback loop. Both major parties understand this cycle. Both strategize around it. What differs is the framing. One side describes defensive countermeasures against manipulation. The other describes legitimate political advantage gained through lawful processes. The deeper issue may not be whether redistricting occurs, it always will, but whether public trust in its fairness survives. If voters perceive systemic imbalance, they disengage or radicalize. If they believe processes are stable, even unfavorable outcomes are more likely to be accepted. Similarly, with investigations like Epstein, the question is not only what documents exist, but whether citizens believe disclosure is handled consistently and without favoritism. Institutional legitimacy, once weakened, is difficult to restore. This moment, therefore, represents more than partisan sparring. It represents a test of democratic resilience. Can the system withstand extreme polarization without collapsing into permanent distrust? For Democrats like Crockett, the argument is that vigilance is necessary to prevent structural entrenchment. For Republicans, the counter-argument is that procedural authority rests with elected state legislatures and that redistricting is part of constitutional federalism. Both positions appeal to different interpretations of fairness. And as the 2026 midterms approach, these battles will intensify. Every district line, every committee subpoena, every rhetorical clash will feed into a larger narrative war about control. The American political system has always contained tension between competition and cooperation, but today, cooperation is scarce. Competition dominates. What this interview ultimately reveals is not just disagreement over policy. It reveals anxiety over the rules themselves. Supporters of Crockett argue she's highlighting structural imbalances that deserve scrutiny. Critics argue Democrats have also benefited from redistricting when in power. The truth, as always in politics, is layered and contested. But one thing is certain: the fight over congressional lines in Texas and other states is not a procedural technicality. It's a preview of the 2026 midterms. And the debate over transparency in high-profile investigations is not fading. It's intensifying. As the House battles over maps and committees battle over subpoenas, the larger struggle is over legitimacy. Who represents the people? Who enforces the law? And who decides what the public gets to see? That's the backdrop of this moment. And whether you see it as defensive politics or partisan escalation, one thing is clear: the next election cycle is already underway, and the fight is not just for votes. It's for control of the system itself.